How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by political scientist Michael Levy.
Good morning, Mike.
Hey, how are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing all right. I did not expect to wake up to war this morning.
Yeah, it's. I was thinking it had been a fairly quiet period, but the recent events have thrown our schedule into a little bit of disarray, and so I'll just leave it at that and kind of kick things over to you to start us off.
Yeah, so as we're recording, we are very much in a fog of war. The Trump administration launched strikes against Venezuela overnight and has announced that U.S. forces have captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores and flown them to the United States following a military operation. According to Attorney General Pam Bondi, they would face charges of narco-terrorism, conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices against the United States. And that they, quote, will soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts, unquote. Key facts, let me stress, are unclear, and we're expecting a news conference about an hour after we record this. But for some background, Maduro has been under U.S. indictment since 2020 on drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges, and the U.S. has relied for years on sanctions and diplomatic pressure against Venezuela until recently upping the stakes with boat strikes on Venezuelan ships and seizure of Venezuelan tankers with oil. What's different, of course, and extraordinary, is the direct use of U.S. military force to seize a sitting head of state. Though I should add, Marco Rubio, U.S. Secretary of State, may dispute that, since he reposted this morning a tweet from last year in which he said that Maduro wasn't the legally elected president of Venezuela. The actions overnight are where the first major controversy comes in. Democratic lawmakers briefed earlier on the boat strikes and maritime operations say they were told by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio that this was not about regime change. So the obvious question is, were lawmakers misled or did the mission change? Complicating this further, reports indicated that administration did not consult the Senate Armed Services Committee. Democratic Senator Ruben Gallego has already called the action illegal, arguing that even if Maduro was reprehensible, that does not give the president authority to launch military operations without Congress. And on the Republican side, Senator Mike Lee was skeptical of the legal footing, but also relayed assurances from Marco Rubio that no additional strikes are expected. The international reactions are breaking along the familiar lines. Cuba and Russia are condemning the actions. Europe is urging restraint. I saw that the Spanish prime minister has already gone on record, and he's been quite critical of Trump in the past. Inside Venezuela, however, the uncertainty is pretty great. Power isn't held only by the formal government institutions. For years, the regime cultivated armed Chavista militias called colectivos that are embedded in neighborhoods, especially in Caracas. And so even if the vice president comes to power or the opposition and Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado claims power, we might be in the midst of some sort of civil war in Venezuela, but uncertain at this moment. At home, we also see in southern Florida, where there are a lot of Venezuelans, Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart has gone on record offering a full endorsement of the action. And I'm sure that there are some Venezuelans in the United States and Venezuelan Americans who are quite happy to see Maduro go. There's one final historical note that's hard to miss. Today is actually, January 3rd, is the 37th anniversary of the U.S. capture of Manuel Noriega. in Panama in 1989, another case where the U.S. seized a foreign leader and brought him to the United States on drug charges. So, Mike, with that couple of minutes of background, I'll throw it to you. Is this closer to Panama in 1989, a swift operation that's going to restore order and everything is going to be hunky-dory in Venezuela? Or do the militias, fractured institutions, and unresolved legal questions make this look a little bit more like Iraq or Afghanistan?
Well, let's hope it's much more like Panama than Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, right now, it's just there's so much that we don't know. I guess two things I think I feel fairly confident in saying is that this does seem to be fairly clearly a violation of international law. Under the UN Charter, you can only use armed forces against another sovereign state only in the cases of self-defense against an armed attack or if the UN Security Council authorizes it. Now, I know the Trump administration has been arguing that what Venezuela is doing with its drug trafficking is in effect an armed attack, but that stretches the definition of that past the breaking point, essentially. It's really a pretext. And ever since we invaded Panama in 1989 to remove a drug trafficking head of state, kind of unofficial U.S. policy, I think, has been, when it comes to unprovoked regime change, there's something like, don't legitimize tactics that you wouldn't tolerate being used against you or your allies. And I think that's a pretty good rule because, I mean, there's good reason for giving foreign heads of state immunity from foreign criminal prosecution while they remain in office. Because when you think about it, how many other countries see the U.S. and U.S. leaders as war criminals? And do we want them trying to forcibly extradite U.S. presidents? Well, of course not. Now, I know the response from a lot of folks, especially on the right, might be, well, the difference is that we're the good guys, and so that's okay. But I think it's important to understand, especially in the context of our long history with Central and South America, that we're not seen as the good guys by a lot of folks, and for, in many cases, pretty good reasons. And so who knows where this is going. I'm certainly not saying that Maduro is a good guy. He's a bad guy, and I'd be happy for him to get what he deserves. But there certainly are going to be implications for this, and I hope that what we get from this is greater than the potential negative implications. But at this point, we just don't know.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, Mike, that Trump has often been quite suspicious of using foreign military intervention and talks about stupid wars. And how do you think he's going to justify this to his MAGA base that is also a little bit suspicious of the U.S. entangling itself? And when we bombed Iran last year, there were murmurings from the right. If it had gone longer, there'd probably be a little bit more dissatisfaction with the launching of strikes. So how do you think he plays this to his MAGA base? And do you think his MAGA base is going to be fairly on board with what happened?
I think he plays it as just a one-off quick strike. We got in, we got out, we did what we needed to do, unlike the corrupt, incompetent Biden administration or Obama administration, which couldn't get out of these things. And so this is the way you do it, not get involved in these long, protracted wars, but the smart, overwhelming use of U.S. force in a very strategic and targeted way, and to remove a guy who everyone knows is a really bad guy, who is, complicit in sending drugs to the United States that harm and kill a lot of American citizens. So I think that's the pitch. And honestly, I that's not a bad case.
And so I have two other questions for you, which is, one is related to a clear and present danger and why the administration wouldn't have consulted the Senate Armed Service Committee, or at least read in the ranking members. And what kind of argument do you think the administration is going to make in their press conference to justify not bringing in the leaders of the Senate and the House? And I'm sort of also wondering, how much people will end up believing, well, Maduro's a bad guy, so who cares? He got what he deserves, so good riddance, even if it's illegal.
Well, I think that under the letter of the law, if I remember correctly, that the only people the president is absolutely required to bring in are the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate, but I need to check that to be sure. But of course, as you know, ever since the Nixon administration, when the War Powers Resolution went into effect, presidents have questioned, or not questioned, have flatly said they don't feel bound by that, presidents of both parties, and that it's more or less a courtesy, if you will, to let members of Congress, those members of Congress, know what's going on. And I would expect that the Trump administration might say, well, they had security concerns about leaks or other things like that, though I find it sort of hard to believe that members of the Senate Armed Services Committee would leak information about that. But I don't know, who knows that. Anyway, I think that's certainly a disputed thing, the War Powers Act, and has been for generations. And so to me, this kind of is just a continuation of how presidents, both Democrat and Republican, have viewed their duty, which they see more as a courtesy to let Congress know what they're planning.
Yeah, you're certainly, your memory is good, Mike, because under the War Powers Resolution, even if it's disputed, and even if presidents haven't really hewed to the letter of the law, it does require the president to submit a report to the Speaker and the President pro tem of the Senate within 48 hours of hostilities occurring, and explaining the legal basis for the action, the scope and purpose, and the expected duration. I don't know if at the press conference later today, by the time folks have either heard this or heard the press conference, if they will make that justification, or will they actually hew to the letter of the War Powers Resolution?
Yeah.
As you noted, most presidents really have not, even if they've paid lip service to it.
Yeah. But clearly a rapidly developing story, and as you pointed out in the open, that next week, I am sure that Trey and Ken, after sort of the dust is settled and we have more information, that they'll definitely be talking about it next week's show.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody will be talking about it. I've had my mother texting me this morning asking for justifications and what's going on. And I told her, hold on, I got to talk about this on the air with
exactly,
Mike.
Yeah. Well, then why don't we move on from that to domestic affairs? And on December 23rd, an important day for at least Seinfeld fans, some of them, and not exactly a Festivus miracle, but on that date, the Supreme Court refused to lift a lower court injunction that blocked the Trump administration from federalizing and deploying National Guard troops to Chicago. Now, Justices Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch dissented in that opinion. Just over a week later, December 31st, President Trump announced that he is dropping, at least for now, efforts to deploy the National Guard in Chicago, LA, and Portland. And in a Truth Social post, he wrote, "We will come back, perhaps in a much different and stronger form, when crime begins to soar again. Only a question of time." Now, that said, the Trump administration is far from done with the state of Illinois. On December 22nd, the Department of Justice sued the state's governor and attorney general over a new state law that restricts immigration enforcement outside of state courthouses and also makes it easier to sue immigration agents for alleged violations of the Constitution during enforcement operations. Now, this follows a lawsuit that the administration also filed against California back in November over new laws in that state that barred immigration enforcement agents from wearing face coverings and mandating that they display ID during enforcement operations. Illinois Governor Pritzker's office has framed the new law as a necessary protection for immigrants in the face of unjust federal action. And Pritzker said, "Illinois, in the face of cruelty and intimidation, has chosen solidarity and support." Now, the Justice Department's view is that the law puts an unacceptable burden on federal law enforcement in the conduct of legal immigration operations. In the statement, the Justice Department said, "Threatening officers with ruinous liability and even punitive damages for executing federal law and for simply protecting their identities and their families also chills the enforcement of federal law and compromises sensitive law enforcement operations." So, Michael, I thought we could start with the Supreme Court's ruling here. Do you think the majority made the right call?
So I want to address the ruling in two ways. I mean, first, on the court got it right. The majority got it right, at least at this stage. They didn't say the president can never deploy the National Guard. They said the president needs a clear legal basis to do it, and that you can't just point to public safety or protecting federal personnel and assume the courts will defer. So that's a meaningful check, even if it's a narrow one, as they read the statute 10 U.S.C. 12406 as meaning regular forces, meaning regular U.S. military. The other part that I want to address and where I get worried is a little bit in Alito's dissent is trying to understand what the alternative vision that Alito and Thomas are laying out. Alito frames his dissent as procedural, but substantively, it reflects a much broader instinct. When a president invokes public safety or protection of federal personnel, Alito's view is that courts mostly should stand back. That's a pretty maximalist view of executive power, and it treats judicial limits as interference rather than as a core constitutional safeguard. And I have to add, this is where, from my perspective, from a progressive perspective, the hypocrisy of Justice Alito is really hard to ignore. This is the same court, with Alito in the majority, that had no problem raising unbriefed or marginal issues when it suits them, because they were arguing that the court had raised issues that were not briefed at the lower court in its majority ruling. Justice Thomas's concurrence in the presidential immunity case is a perfect recent example of these unbriefed or marginal issues. So suddenly, Justice Alito is looking at the statute and feeling that the majority had gone beyond what the lawyers had argued in the lower court. And so I'm a little bit worried that Justice Alito is trying to have it both ways. When he supports something and he needs to use unbriefed issues, he will. And when he doesn't, he won't. And so I'm kind of curious, a few questions back to you, Mike. This is that with Trump's pullback, do you see it as a sign that he is going to pull back indefinitely? Or do you think that they're going to eventually invoke the Insurrection Act? Or do you think that something else is going to happen when he talks about coming back stronger?
I've learned to take all of President Trump's Truth Social comments with a grain of salt. I think he likes to keep his options open and keep people guessing. That seems to be a pattern throughout his career. But, I'm glad you brought up Justice Alito's dissent, at least that part where he takes issue, right, with the court, because the court specifically said to the parties, hey, focus on what regular forces mean. And for folks who haven't been following this, the reason why this is important is that the law that Michael mentioned gives the president the ability to federalize guard troops when, and I quote, the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And so that's why you say, well, what does the regular forces mean? And that's what the court asked both parties to brief, which they did not do when they brought this issue before the district court. And what Alito was saying, and Thomas, who joined that dissent, said, well, why are we asking them to brief things that they chose not to brief? And Alito says, listen, we should just assume that the party's interpretation of this is the right one, and we shouldn't go beyond what they're briefing. And that, to me, I agree with you, seems to me a weak argument, because to me, the fundamental role of the court isn't to decide who makes a better argument. The fundamental role of the court is to determine what the law means. And so the idea that you would ignore anything related to that duty just because the parties didn't bring it up, that seems to me to be a dereliction of that duty. I think back to, there was this old documentary on the Supreme Court called Inside the Marble Temple that I used to show to my classes. And there was a point where Justice Scalia was on, and he said, sometimes the side with the worst case, the worst argument, wins the case, and their attorney will go back to the client and say, look what a wonderful job I did for you. And Scalia laughed and said, but they just made a bad argument, but the law happened to be on their side. And I think Justice Scalia was right then, is that you have to look to the law, not to what the brief says, if it doesn't cover that. So I thought that was a particularly weak argument by Justice Alito. But that said, I think also that Alito is right that the president, when it comes to security matters, is due quite a bit of deference. Now, part of the argument of the government was that this was simply not reviewable by the court, which even, I think that was a bridge too far even for Alito and Thomas. But I do agree that there's quite a bit of deference that is due to the president on these issues.
I would certainly agree. I don't want to say I agree with Alito, because that's probably stretching the bounds of credulity, that normal presidents do deserve the benefit of the doubt and some deference, particularly when we're talking about protecting the public safety. But I also look at the court in the deference that they give to presidents and talk about that hypocrisy a little bit again, which is it seems like Alito bends over backwards to find emergency power support for anything that Trump wants to do. And I have to look back at when President Biden claimed emergency authority under an existing statute to expand student loan forgiveness, the court didn't defer. And so I think at least the majority is being consistent that the executive needs to prove that the emergency requires this deference for the president to get it. But I'm sort of wondering, if we sort of just zoom out from this, how do you square the dissent, Alito's dissent, embrace of a very muscular executive with conservative commitments to federalism and judicial restraint? And I'm sort of wondering, going back to your discussions, I think it was before the holidays, about that tension coming back to the unitary executive theory that you're maybe a little bit more sympathetic to. And I'm kind of curious what you see as the limiting power, the limiting principles to presidential power in these kinds of situations.
Well, on the issue of judicial restraint, actually, I should have mentioned this earlier. I think that the majority got it wrong here. And it's a surprise, but here's my problem with majority's argument. The majority's argument essentially is that reading the statute, and this is why they were fixated on the whole thing about what regular forces means, because the argument here, if you take the majority's construction, what would have had to have happened is that the president is unable with regular forces, which they determined meant the United States military, to execute the laws of the United States. Only then can the president federalize the Guard. So this would basically be a three-step or multi-step process. There would be some sort of major disturbance that would mean that the federal law could not be executed. Then the presumably have to send in the U.S. military, federal forces, and then if federal forces were not able to control the situation enough to allow the laws to be executed, then the Guard could be sent in. That to me is a logical mess, essentially, and I don't think is what really the statute intended to mean. It seems to be a very strained interpretation, and so I don't follow that. I think Justice Alito was right in saying that, unable to execute the laws doesn't mean just that, you don't have the legal authority to send in the U.S. military, which I don't think he would, but that you simply can't send them in for whatever reason, including not having the legal authority. And that, to me, makes a lot more sense as a reading, as a sort of a commonsensical, not stretched reading of the statute. And so that's what I think Alito got more right than the majority. But having said that, I also think that I think it was Justice Kavanaugh in his concurrence who said, "Listen, should we really be holding forth on these issues in what's a shadow docket sort of opinion? No, I mean these are major issues. This is not the place, granting an emergency stay or not. This is not the place to hash them out." But weirdly, then Justice Kavanaugh says, even so, I will take a position on one of these issues, what regular forces mean, and I'll agree with the majority. And so, in the end, I would have ruled for the administration. I would have lifted the lower court stay, using Kavanaugh's argument about this not being the place to decide on the substance, and then picking up on Alito's argument for granting substantial deference to the president's determination about whether the laws are unable to be executed. But having said that, I want to be really clear. I don't agree with the policy. I most definitely do not agree with the policy, but that's a public policy question for me, not a legal question. So I think this is arguably legal for the president to do, though I'm not completely convinced, but I think it is a bad, horrible, bad policy.
Yeah, Mike, you actually answered the next question that I wanted to ask you about this, because I wanted to get into Kavanaugh's concurring opinion and see if you disagree with the majority, but maybe that you agreed with Kavanaugh, who wanted to decide on narrower grounds, because Kavanaugh was talking about the broader reasoning that the court was using as potentially having unintended consequences in future crises that might actually harm a president from being able to faithfully execute the laws or be able to quell insurrection or whatever the case may be. But you even find Kavanaugh's logic maybe a little bit like he's stretching into contortions to get to the. So I guess the question back to you is, why do you think, if you disagree with the majority and disagree with Kavanaugh's concurrence, why do you think Kavanaugh was in the majority?
Well, I think my read of his concurrence was that he felt fairly certain that that part of the majority's argument was a strong argument, and on the basis of that, felt comfortable siding with them. And so I disagree with him on the interpretation, and I think there's certainly a tension there, right? He says, well, we shouldn't hold forth on this, but I am going to sort of hold forth on this. And so I see his point, but I just am a little uncomfortable with, I guess, what I would see is that amount of what I'll call judicial, not exactly activism, but it kind of feels that way a little bit. I really am uncomfortable, especially when it comes to national security issues, whether it's domestic or international, when the court becomes fairly muscular and is less deferential. And I'd feel that way regardless who the president is, regardless of how I feel about the wisdom of the actual underlying policy.
Yeah, that I definitely get that. I'm sort of like wondering, as we started this conversation about what comes next, because I was thinking about and doing, going back to research Eisenhower's use of the National Guard in civil rights cases in the South and see what analogies might be similar to the current circumstance and what might be different. Because I'm sympathetic to what you were saying earlier about presidents needing some broad discretion, particularly, if there's a Shays Rebellion or something, right? Like, what is the legal authority for a president to put down an insurrection? But we do have an Insurrection Act, and the Insurrection Act can be invoked. Yeah. Though I don't think in the cases of what's happening in Chicago and Broadview and in LA, that amounts to an insurrection. So I'm curious, like, if the president does come back and invoke the Insurrection Act, is how he's going to justify that it actually is an insurrection, particularly when January 6th, in his view, wasn't an insurrection.
Well, and I think we've seen this before, where they'll throw out almost any kind of bizarre, stretched interpretation, right? The idea, right, that migrant caravans are a foreign invasion of the United States. I mean, we saw that in the first Trump administration, and so you can stretch these things however much you want, essentially, which doesn't necessarily make them right. And again, it comes back to I try to always go back to what the law says and what it allows and what is the most common sense meaning, particularly in the context of when the law was actually written. And I become really uncomfortable when my side or the other side seems to always stretch the law, or interpret the law always in the direction of the policy outcomes that they prefer. That, to me, gives me a great deal of pause.
Definitely on board with that.
So, I also wanted to talk about that lawsuit that I mentioned over the new Illinois law, right? There was this provision in it that bans immigration enforcement within 1,000 feet of courthouses, and that's similar to laws that are in place already in California and New York. And also, there's civil liability for the arresting officer or officers, $10,000 per arrest, plus attorney's fees. And it seems to me that this is almost certainly unconstitutional. I mean, it's a blanket prohibition against federal officials carrying out federal law, and that to me looks like a clear violation of the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. I mean, federal law cannot be geographically nullified by the states, even if it's in a service of, what I see personally as a noble cause, protecting immigrants. I mean, we in part fought a civil war over that very thing when the southern states wanted to nullify federal laws. And I think this is just an example of doing that in a more geographically constrained way. Again, I am so for the policy, but I just don't think that it passes constitutional muster. What do you think, Michael?
So I'm uncertain, and I'll sort of like talk a little bit about why I'm uncertain. So Illinois' core counter argument is going to be that they're not stopping the federal government from enforcing immigration law. They're just declining to help. And that they believe that the federal government can't require the states to use their officers or resources to enforce federal law, and that states are allowed to opt out of federal enforcement schemes, even if Congress dislikes it. I don't know if that's a winning argument in the court. I don't think it's going to be, particularly once it gets into the federal appeals process and if it goes to the Supreme Court. And I know that the DOJ is arguing that Illinois' laws go well beyond non-cooperation and amount to what they're calling affirmative interference. And so I doubt that it's going to hold constitutional muster, but with many things, whether it's Gavin Newsom in California or J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, I think that they want to get caught trying to oppose the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say that I think there's much less of a problem with states refusing to assist federal agents. But as I read the law, and I pulled up the provision a couple days ago to read the whole thing. There's a lot there. It seems to me that it goes further than that. And I think that actually the DOJ's position on this is right. But if it's just not assisting, I read that as being perfectly fine. But punishing federal agents for carrying out the law, I think that crosses that line pretty clearly. And again, it's frustrating for me because what I see more and more on both sides, whether it's Democratic governors or, the Trump administration, passing these, what seems to me to be clearly unconstitutional laws or things that ignore rule of law entirely to make some sort of partisan point or in the hope that, well, maybe we'll get a good ruling from some judge somewhere. And I think once you go down that road, things get really messy really quickly. And that is a major, major concern to me.
It does come, I should note, it does come from the Illinois law, from a sense of frustration, not just of the governor, but among many Illinoisans. And as you know, as some listeners know, I do live in Chicago, and there is a palpable sense that the ICE officials and other federal agents have used unnecessary force against peaceful protesters. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a worry, and you hear terms, and I'm not going to use the term, but use terms like Gestapo-like tactics and things like that. It feels like they are going beyond what is necessary to show force and to harm people who are otherwise peacefully protesting outside of federal facilities. But again, I don't necessarily think that the law that they've passed is going to pass constitutional muster, but I think it comes from that sense of frustration. We've got to do something.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that. I am deeply sympathetic to that for sure. Any other thoughts on this, Michael, before we move on?
No, happy to move on.
Okay, yeah, because, I know you mentioned to me last week or in this last week that you had listened to the bonus supporters episode part of the show I did with Trey, where I made kind of an announcement. Now, a lot of folks didn't hear that because a lot of folks aren't actually supporters and don't have access to that. By the way, you can get access by becoming a supporter or, letting me know, and I can happy to send you the full midweek episode, a little pitch in the middle there. But I think it is kind of important because I made sort of a big announcement. At least it felt like a big announcement to me. And you kind of had a reaction to it and suggested we talk about it on the regular show so all of our listeners could hear about it. And so I'll kind of leave it at that. Maybe you can just start with your reaction to what I said on that bonus show last time.
Yeah. So I guess the good news is that when I'm not co-hosting with you, Mike, I am listening to the show. So you know that, and I am a supporter of the show as well, as you know.
Yep.
But and the last episode of the 2025. And you came out, and you came out as not a Democrat, and the Discord immediately did what the internet does, and I think they asked some questions around, okay, but what are you really? And I'll say my first reaction to hearing you say that you're not a Democrat, but also saying that you're still likely to continue voting for the Democrats is, yeah, you are. You're still a Democrat. You just don't like the party very much right now. But I was also reflecting, because I've known you now for 30 years, that you've been on quite the journey. When we were in grad school together, I thought you were to the right of Attila the Hun, and I may have told you that. I'm not
Yeah, I
sure
think
if I
so,
did.
yeah.
And so you've done a lot of migration, from being conservative to being left of center left Democrat, and now describing yourself as politically homeless. But what really struck me is, as you were talking with Trey, was get it. I still call myself a Democrat, but I'm deeply disenchanted with the Democratic Party establishment. And it's not just like the gerontocracy of the party, but it's also the vibe. I mean, the party feels stuck in 2006. And while they're trying to govern and speak to the issues of voters in 2026. And so, when we think about like the issues, that people feel in their bones, like rent and childcare and healthcare, they may not be thinking of rule of law, but folks like yourself and me are thinking about constitutional principles that, the Democrats sound like a bunch of mealy-mouthed 5-point plans that feel more like those terrible corporate compliance training videos that you have to do rather than something to rally behind. And so when we've talked in the past about like people like Gavin Newsom or AOC or Bernie, they break through because they don't sound like they're asking permission to speak. But here's like the nerdy part that I want to ask you about, Mike, is that party identification generally moves fairly slowly. So when I was re-examining 2025 polling surveys, it still shows that partisan identifiers, that it's pretty split. About 46% Republican leaning, 45% Democratic leaning. So to me, like that's not a Democratic collapse. But when you also look at these polls that show the Democratic Party's favorability, it's usually around 30% favorable, 60% unfavorable. Whereas the Republicans is more, it's a minus 30 split for the Democrats. Republicans are more minus 15. And so I want to take this back to Discord because there was a discussion recently on Democratic Party favorability. And to handle check Master Splinter, who wrote the other day that the DNC is circling the wagons. And from my perspective, the rot looks like it runs pretty deep. To which you replied, on that point, I agree. So I'm wondering, like, is your D-line about the rot in the Democratic Party? And is it about the vibe of the Democratic Party? Or what is it exactly? Because you say it's really not going to change who you're going to vote for. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, what's that feeling?
Well, I feel like both parties are rotten, but certainly I have issues with the rot in the DNC and the feeling that it's kind of like a CYA operation, to throw out another acronym there in quick succession. But no, to me, it's really more of a political philosophy thing. And this is why I say I'm politically homeless, because I'm a big believer in what some fancy people might call epistemic humility, which is essentially that idea that we admit that we don't know a whole hell of a lot, but we know that what we do know is provisional and incomplete in our knowledge. And that's not something we see very much of in either party. And I understand why. I mean, everything in modern politics, our culture, our media environment works against that. Candidates, political leaders in kind of a populist democracy, which we have, you can't afford to be humble. Almost every single thing in electoral politics selects against humility and caution and incrementalism. And so that's why I am politically homeless, essentially. And I realized that I kind of gotten away from that. And so I'm never going to have a political home because honestly, I see myself as a conservative. I said on that show, I'm a Burkean conservative. I've said that for a lot of years. I'm not really. If you want to get pedantic about it, and I will, what the hell, I'm an academic. I'm more of a Humean conservative. And what I mean by that is Edmund Burke sort of sees tradition as kind of an imperfect wisdom that we accumulate over time. And so we don't want to mess with that wisdom of the ages. I'm closer to David Hume on this, who says, we have these long-standing institutions, these laws, these practices. I'm not saying they're wise or they're good, but they're often kind of a load-bearing part of a fragile system that's built around, our habits, our expectations. So if we rip them out, well, that's going to be risky, regardless of whether our intentions are good or not. And so I think that's right. And, I think along with Hume that our systems, our practices, they come into place to solve certain problems that came up at the time, problems specific to that time. And so when the times change, well, those solutions can end up being more and more of a mismatch to the problems we have today. I would argue that our Constitution in and of itself is increasingly a mismatch to the society and problems we have today. But even so, that doesn't mean I'd be in favor of saying, well, let's just rewrite the Constitution, because that's like you risk kind of pulling. I kind of see government and society as this massive Jenga tower, and you start just yanking out little pieces of it, big pieces of it. Well, you're likely to have the whole thing fall down. And so I think David Hume got a lot right. So I'm really more of a Humean in that, I suppose, than a Burkean. And yeah, I've been spending plenty of time over the break kind of revisiting Hume and Burke and all that sort of thing. But clearly, this is a philosophy that just does not work in the 21st century. I mean, it's a horrible cultural fit because modern people are not conservative, and they're never going to be. I get it. And I think in the end, that kind of gets to my sort of cultural political pessimism. I think things are just going to continue to get worse because I think fundamentally that conservative viewpoint is right, and that we can't go on the way we're going. And, in the end, I said it before, I sure hope that the GPT, Gemini, Claude, Philosopher King will save us, because I don't think we're going to save ourselves.
Well, first, Mike, I have to tell you, I'm getting some PTSD for my old political theory classes, which I got through, but were never my favorite. But maybe you've now suggested a series we can do on maybe constitutional amendments you would add. If we're not going to rewrite the Constitution, what are some changes do you think that could be made to help to make government work better? But I'm kind of curious, since you talked about being politically homeless, do you think, however long that journey was ago, that you started migrating from right to the left, did you ever feel at home in the Democratic Party, or did you always feel homeless even within the Democratic Party because of that disconnect between your core philosophical beliefs and the messaging that was coming out from the party?
I think I felt comfortable with the Democratic Party when Barack Obama was president. Barack Obama, to me, an amazing president. I know some people would say he seemed kind of cold and technocratic. Maybe that's what I liked about him in some ways. And I think also, I always sensed, people will probably argue this, but I know people on the right said he was kind of arrogant. And so I got the sense that there actually was this sort of deep understanding of a lot of the things I talk about. I mean, he's a guy who could quote, theologians and philosophers, and I think he really understood at a deep level a lot of the things that I'm talking about. And so in a way, I feel closest to maybe Barack Obama than anyone else, who sort of, I think, does have, I know people are going to go crazy about this on the right, a belief in that kind of epistemic humility and understanding about the frailty of human judgment and the danger of hubris. But on the same token, he had to govern and understands it in our modern political environment. When are you going to get another bite at the apple? And when you do, you have to do everything you can, which is why, again, our system is just set up in this horrific way where you just can't put in small policy changes and then iterate on them. Because there are plenty of things about, say, Obamacare that I think, needed changing and so forth. But, that's not how our system works when power shifts back and forth. And so I guess when Barack Obama was president, I sort of felt like I had a home. But then he was only president for 8 years, and things started shifting pretty quickly after that for me.
As you talk about that, I actually wonder then, because when you're talking about Humean philosophy or Burkean philosophy, you're talking about philosophy. And I sort of almost think about Barack Obama, and I don't want to use the term too much, as a philosopher king in a sense. And he combined this really interesting background, right? Like he grew up, wasn't wealthy, grew up with a single mom. His dad lived thousands of miles away from him. He went to law school, got a Harvard law degree, but he was also a community activist. So when you listen to Barack Obama, it's funny because the right would talk about him as a celebrity or as this arrogant person. I'm sure he was, and I'm sure he is, because to run for president, you have to have an ego. You have to
Absolutely.
have some level of arrogance. But he always sounded reflective, and he when he was giving us an answer to a question. It sounded like in real time he was thinking deeply about it rather than giving you the bumper sticker answer that a Donald Trump might try to give you, though I don't think Trump could actually give you the bumper sticker answer. He'd probably meander 72 ways to get to build the wall.
The swerve.
The weave.
Yeah, the weave. There, I got the weave. Thank you.
But yeah, so I'm intrigued on as you start to do the analysis of your transcripts over time, if we're going to actually see a philosophical change, or if it's going to be the same old Mike, just maybe a little bit more unleashed because you don't feel as beholden to a political party.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that point. I think in part the reason why I have kind of abandoned calling myself a Democrat and renounced that affiliation is I think in a way it might help me see things more clear. I use an analogy here. This time of year, I'm always thinking about football. Sadly for me, as a Steelers fan, we have a great tradition of being slightly above average. But anyway, when I'm watching the Steelers, I'm a lot more likely to see things like holding or pass interference against the opposing team because the Steelers are my team, and I'm just that's my orientation going in. But what I've noticed is I've been watching a lot more games. Kimberly and I have been watching, like taking out Sunday just to watch football games. It really doesn't matter as long as they're not like a horrible game. We'll just watch it. And what I've noticed is that I feel like when I'm watching games in which I don't have as much of a rooting interest, I can much more easily appreciate and understand good plays and bad plays. And the game seems different to me. And I feel like I'm sharper because I think my fandom isn't clouding my vision. And so that's why I wanted to, in part, pull away from that and say, well, am I kind of defaulting to say, well, I'm going in assuming the Democrats are right and the Republicans are wrong. Now, I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, but to me, that's too much of a bias going in. And so I think that might help on that particular point, if that makes sense.
I have to say, Mike, I must have been a better sports fan than you have been, because for all of my love of North Carolina Tar Heels basketball, I am someone at the games when we get a call or we get a break, I'll say to the buddy next to me, I'm like, we got lucky on that one, except on the true 50 calls when there's no video evidence either way, do I always see it my team's way rather than the other team's way. But I'm sure you're also feeling a little bit sad from Ohio State, but let's not belabor too much on sports.
Well, the other thing I guess I'll point out is that I mentioned that this is unlikely to change any of my actual voting patterns in the near-term future. And that's because being politically homeless, then I have to say, well, okay, what essentially is not my team, but what is the lesser of two evils? And this is where rule of law comes into play, because traditionally conservatives believe in rule of law maybe more than those on the left. And so that's why philosophically maybe conservatism is more my home. But when we look at the modern world, what we see is a Trump administration that laughs at the concept of rule of law. It's power will do what power will do, and we're not even going to make any bones about it. In fact, they crow about how transparent they are in just doing whatever the hell they want to do, essentially. And to me, that is just abhorrent. And so when I have to make a decision between what seems like a Trump administration that has zero respect for rule of law, and the Quislings in the congressional Republican, caucus that are absolutely willing to go along with that, with a few exceptions, the Rand Pauls and Thomas Massey's, a couple folks here and there. But so what are my options? Well, my options are my only option really is to oppose this sort of complete disregard of rule of law. And so, that's why in practice, I will almost certainly still vote Democratic until such a time as MAGA passes from the scene, which, I hope will be at some point in the near future. And then maybe it'll be a little bit different. But for right now, functionally, I guess you could say, if voting patterns are party affiliation, then, for all practical purposes, I remain functionally a Democrat.
Yeah. So two quick things. I mean, one is I almost I wanted to laugh a little bit when you did the show and mentioned that you're politically homeless, because I was thinking the title of a blog post could be ChatGPT said I'm not a Democrat, so I'm not a Democrat anymore. But more seriously, I think this is why the conversations that you and Trey have are really instructive and really helpful, because both of you are politically homeless at the moment. And I sort of was wondering and reflecting after listening to the show, because sometimes it's hard to have a conversation with someone who is a dyed-in-the-wool MAGA person. Because I'll take one simple example of this and why I struggle is that on the Epstein files, right? If there had been a free vote before Trump came out and the administration came out against releasing the Epstein files, most of the Republicans would have voted in favor of releasing all the Epstein files. And then Trump says no. And then nobody's willing except for Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene and a couple of others to go against this. And then once Trump says, okay, it's okay, I want them all released, then all the Republicans go and do it. It's just like, so it almost feels like there's a suspension of any spine, a suspension of any brain by many MAGA folks, just waiting for Trump to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on something before they move. And so I do look forward to the conversations you and Trey have, because it looks like two people wrestling a little bit and not necessarily just reflexively going into your corners.
Yeah, I'd like to think so, at least. And one other point I want to make is I'm not a rule of law absolutist, because I think there is a good argument to be made that at some point things can be so dire that you have to forget about what the law says. I mean, I hate to do this. I will actually say something positive about Thomas Jefferson. Longtime fans of the show know how painful it is to me. You know, hey, he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. And yeah, I mean, absolutely the case, which is why I mentioned on that last show, the Republicans who were conservatives who said when in 2015 or 2016, this is the Flight 93 election, the country's going down and we need to do something to save it. I think there are instances where that is absolutely the case, but I think that Donald Trump has massively abused this, calling everything an emergency to justify what he has done. It essentially delegitimizes, it makes the term emergency meaningless. And so there are exceptions, but they are so incredibly rare and need to be used so carefully. And clearly Donald Trump does not think that way. And so there you go.
Well, Mike, again, welcome to your homelessness, and may you find peace. May you find peace.
Well, that would be pretty interesting if I ever found peace in that. But we'll see what happens. It should be interesting. And I should mention that for listeners who didn't catch that conversation with Trey, the whole impetus for this is that toward the end of the year, I actually pulled a bunch of transcripts from the show and ran them through GPT and was trying to figure out what kind of stuff we did well or not so well. And then I decided, well, I'm wondering if I run these transcripts through and ask GPT, what would you say my ideology is? And I decided to do that. Did I have too much time on my hands? Maybe. But anyway, it said, well, you're not really a Democrat. It's okay. So that kind of started this whole thing off. But yeah, I am sure we'll be talking more about this in some way, shape, or form throughout the year. But yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad we got to kind of have this discussion in front of more folks than just the folks who are supporters of the show and heard that discussion with Trey. So thanks for bringing it up. So I think that pretty much brings us to a close for this show, though we do have a bunch of things we're going to talk about on the midweek episode. We want to talk about that 60 Minutes Inside CCOT piece that was pulled, and some thoughts on what Trump promised and delivered on or didn't in 2025, for better or for worse. Get into the Kennedy Center renaming. So we have a bunch of things on the midweek show. We hope you will listen to that. And of course, if you are a supporter, you'll be getting that whole thing. If not, you get like the first 10, 15 minutes or something like that. We hope you'll consider becoming a supporter, and you can always find out how to do that. We always put the links in the show notes there. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to get our full length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the show, we get that's not a problem. Just send me an email on mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really helps us out a lot if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're using, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producing team. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. And we'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,